Paul Kruger was born on his grandfather's farm in Bullhook on the 10th of October, 1825, exactly 200 years ago. Paul's parents were Caspar Kruger and Elsie Stein, but his mom died when he was very young. Droughts and locusts and migrating herds of buck forced him to lead a nomadic existence in the Karoo, and he was hardened by nature and he was schooled by the Bible. He received only 3 months of formal education. Most of the time he was homeschooled. He read the Bible daily, and he memorized a large amount of it. As a young boy of 10 years old, Paul Kruger set out on the Great Trek under Hendrik Potgieter, one of the first of the Great Treks. And his father, Caspar Kruger, joined the trek party of Hendrik Potgieter, which was one of the first of the Great Treks, back in 1835. At age 11, he was one of the 40 men who successfully defeated the previously unbeaten Madibili. The Madibili were a section of the Zulus who had fled from King Shaka's anger, and they were going to probably all be executed. So they decided to flee, and they created a path of blood, the Diffikan or Mifikan, wiping out about 156 tribes across the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, creating the depopulated areas into which the trekkers later moved. But the Madibili were Zulus, but they were renegade, rogue Zulus, and they'd never been beaten before. But at the Battle of Vekkop, the Voortrekkers defeated them, 40 of them, and to think an 11-year-old could be called a man. And he was one of the men fighting with the muskets. I brought a musket, a live, real musket here today that you can handle and feel how heavy these things are, how hard they are to wield. Well, at the Battle of Vekkop in 1836, on this very hill, the trekkers beat the Madibili, and this is the monument that there's today. And you can see the man, he's holding a Bible in his left hand, and he's holding his musket in his right hand, and it's pointed downwards in submission to Almighty God, and it's like a shield of faith. The arrows are bending and breaking against him, showing what Ephesians 6 speaks about, that with a shield of faith you can put out all the fiery darts to the wicked one. So it's a magnificent symbolism in the Voortrekker monument at Vekkop. Oom Paul had a rough upbringing on the trail, you could say. And in the wilderness, he became proficient in horse riding and in hunting. He would sometimes be given one bullet and sent out to get supper. And so he couldn't miss. And this is why the Brits had such a hard time during the Anglo-Boer War, because these Boers were trained, one shot, one kill. They didn't waste. They weren't like the Americans today who spray the entire environment with automatic fire and hit almost nothing. Just to give you one example, do you know in the Nigerian Civil War, Nigeria, one country, between 1967 and 1970, in the 3 years of the war, they shot more bullets in that one war than all bullets fired on all sides in the Second World War. Because in the Second World War, people were using bolt-action rifles, and I've got an example of a bolt-action rifle of the Anglo-Boer War era there. Because in the Second World War, people were mostly using bolt-action rifles. The Nigerian Civil War shot more bullets than every army on every front of both the European and the Pacific theatres in the Second World War, and North Africa combined. Just showing when you give people automatic weapons, they waste. And the Americans are probably the best of that. They just spray the countryside, and just like the Nigerians, they must have got a lot of poor monkeys and birds in the tree, laid waste to entire forests, firing over their heads with automatic machine guns. I heard when I was in Nigeria, many of them would go to the front, fire all the ammunition, over their heads, of course, so they're not being a target as well, and then they'd go back saying, we need new ammunition. So fully automatic weapons have not been an improvement. You think that the Boers with muskets were able to cause such havoc with the British Empire, but that's getting off my subject.
Dr. Hammond?
Yes.
Where exactly is Vekkop?
It's right. It's in the Transvaal. Let's see if we can see it in one of these maps. I don't see Vekkop specifically here, but it's not far from Potchefstroom and Rustenburg. But this is the beautiful monument there. Now, Paul Kruger served in numerous campaigns against the raiding tribes, including the Makapan in 1854 and against Mapela in 1858. He was a leader in the First Anglo-Boer War of 1888 to 1881. And Paul Kruger's father first settled into what is today called Potchefstroom. Later he moved to what today is Rustenburg. At age 16, Paul Kruger carved his own farm out of the wilderness. I think they grew up a little faster then. By age 17, he already had 2 farms. And at 17, he married Anna Marie Estelle Dupree, and his wife and child died in January 1846. So he was already a widower at age 17. He then married again in 1847, Gazina Susanna Dupree, no relation, despite them both having the same surname. And together they were blessed with 7 daughters and 9 sons. Before the end of his life, he had over 144 grandchildren. Can you imagine how often you would have been having birthday parties? And I'm sure he had trouble remembering all the names of his grandchildren. Forget about the birth dates. But you can safely say that Oom Paul was pro-life. He was the founding member of the Gereformeerde Kerk, which was formed in Rustenburg 1859. The Doppers, as the Gereformeerde Kerk members were known, separate from the Niederduitse Gereformeerde Kerk over a new hymn book, which they believed contradicted some of the principles of the foundational documents, the Synod of Dort, the Heidelberg Catechism, and the Belgic Confession. Basically, what came down to is that the Gereformeerde Kerk believed you had to sing psalms and hymns, scriptures, not made up hymns. It had to be directly from the scripture, it was not acceptable. The Gereformeerde Kerk founded the Potchefstroom University College for Higher Christian Education. And that's what it used to say. I remember driving past Potch University and see Higher Christian Education was the name of the university. Potchefstroom was a great Christian university for many years, renowned around the world. I don't think you could say that for Northwestern University today. The Gereformeerde Kerk used only hymns from the Bible, mainly the Psalms, and other schriftenbemenings drawn directly from the Bible, scriptural songs. I'm sure they would not have been at all happy with the Bethel and Hell song today. When I went to Australia a while ago, the people there said it's not an I, it should actually be an E. They've got the wrong vowel, it should be Hell song. And apparently Sydney used to have a very, very powerful, strong evangelical contingent, but they said Hell song wrecked that. The spiritual life in Australia has gone down, 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 downhill. And unfortunately, they're exporting their degenerate form of worship around the world. And the amount of churches using Hell song is disturbing, along with the strobe lights, of course, and all that sort of thing that seems to be part of it, and smoke machines. Well, his first involvement in politics began at 25. Imagine, a Voortrekker at age 10, a soldier already, or Commando at age 11, having his own farm at age 16, married at age 17, and in politics at age 25. I think they grew up a lot faster than we do today. And then you've got these youngsters today in their 20s and 30s trying to find themselves and still living in their mother's basement, and dad's got to bail them out of their debts, and mom's got to do their washing, and they're not capable of living a life. And I mean, I know people in their 40s and 50s who haven't yet grown up yet. I mean, just still playing video games, haven't got a life, haven't got a wife, can't look after themselves. So we've got a bunch of wimps out there today. They would have done better to be on the Great Trek, or in my generation, join the army. Paul Kruger was a field coronet in the Commandos and eventually became Commandant General of the South African Republic. He was appointed a member of the Commission of the Volksraad to draw up the Constitution for the Transvaal Republic. He was present at the Salt River Convention of 1852, in which the British government recognized the independence of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. What many people don't know about is, after the Great Trek, the British went and took over the Orange Free State, turned the Orange River colony. And fortunately, in 1852, they were talked into, footsack, leave us alone. And in 1875, Oom Paul was elected as a member of the Executive Council. Shortly after that, he became Vice President of the Transvaal. When President T.F. Burgers came to power in 1872, Paul Kruger couldn't support his liberal policies, so he resigned from government in early 1873. Now, this T.F. Burgers was quite a character. First of all, he minted a coin with his face on it. And the Burgers were so horrified, idolatry. How dare you put your face on a coin? Like, do you think you're Caesar or something like that? And so that was a problem, but his worst mistake he ever made was he tried to tax the Boers. They thought, you've got to be kidding, we went on a great trek to get away from taxes. So they yacked these tax collectors off their farm with their muskets, and that was the end of it. So this set the stage for the First Anglo-Boer War, because with the declining popularity of Burgers, Lord Shepstone decided to seize the Transvaal Republic and annex it to the British Empire. And he could get away with it because Burgers was so unpopular with his own citizens. So unpopular was the president, Burgers, and so unpopular were his policies, like taxing, not one single Boer responded to his call for the Commandos to defend their independence. And that's quite a story as well. So how many have read King Solomon's Mines, or She, of Sir Ryder Haggard? So Sir Ryder Haggard was one of 11 Natal mounted police who rode into Pretoria, up from Natal, hoisted the Union Jack on the flagpole that should have had the Voortrekker, brought the Voortrekker down, put the Union Jack up and declared the Transvaal is now the Transvaal colony. And they annexed Transvaal to Britain. And not a Boer decided to defend the Republic because they had an idolatrous president who tried to tax him. And so the British in 1877 gained control with 11 men, seized the whole country of the Transvaal. But then the British were stupid enough to try and tax the farmers, so that's when Paul Kruger swung into action. At a historic gathering at Paardenkraal in December 1880, the citizens restored the Republic, electing Paul Kruger, Piet Joubert, and M.W. Pretorius to form the triumvirate, 3 leaders to lead the Republic. And you've heard of Paardenkraal, everyone came and laid a stone, and this was part of their covenant to resist the British and to evict them from the Transvaal. After the Transvaal was annexed by Britain in 1877, Paul Kruger led the resistance movement. And he visited Britain as the leader of the delegation protesting the violation of the Sand River Convention, demanding the restoration of Transvaal independence. And most people today, I find, don't even know about the First Anglo-Boer War. But after the Boer victory at the Battle of Majuba in 1881, very spectacular victory, Paul Kruger played the pivotal role in the negotiations with the British, which led to the restoration of Transvaal independence. We'll speak a bit about this after tea time in another presentation, because most people don't know about the First Anglo-Boer War. It's the only war that the British Empire lost in the 19th century at the hands of Transvaal farmers. On the 30th of December 1880, at age 55, Paul Kruger was elected president of the Transvaal, which he remained president of Transvaal for a long time thereafter, 5 different elections. He visited Europe on a number of occasions, was received with great honor in Germany and France and Belgium, the Netherlands and Spain. And in the elections of 1883, 1888, 1893 and 1898, Paul Kruger was victorious. Every time he defeated his main rival, Piet Joubert. Piet Joubert should have gotten a complex. In fact, you might recall in the 20th century, Jan Smuts lost 5 elections in a row to James Barry Hertzog, General Judge James Barry Hertzog, who was the most popular prime minister ever in the Union of South Africa. So Smuts and Piet Joubert can stand as the most unsuccessful politicians in South African history, losing 5 elections in a row. Well, the discovery of gold on the Witwatersrand, 1884, had far-reaching political consequences. Uitlanders, foreigners, poured into the Transvaal. And by the way, that's also why we've got the 2nd oldest communist party in the world in South Africa, because the Communist Party came in with the miners. And at one point, their slogan was, workers of the world unite for a white South Africa. That was the slogan of the Southern Communist Party. But these people have no principles. That's why they change from one side to the other regularly. But that's why South Africa's got such a huge communist party, the second oldest in the world. Well, this dramatically changed the demographics in Transvaal and threatened to overwhelm the independence of the Boer Republic, because these hard-working Boer farmers were soon being outnumbered by these Uitlanders who were pouring in, who had no commitment to the country. They were just there for the gold. In his memoirs, Paul Kruger declared, instead of rejoicing at the discovery of gold, they should have wept because of how it would cause their land to be soaked in blood. Like the amount of countries in the world who must curse the fact that they had oil under their sand, because that led to how many wars. So sometimes, whether it's gold, diamonds, oil, natural resources, it's often a tragedy. But Paul Kruger was very far-sighted in his concern for nature conservation. He's credited with establishing the initial Sabi Reserve in the eastern Transvaal, which has grown into the greatest game reserve on earth, the Kruger National Park. And this is way ahead of everyone else. Long before President Teddy Roosevelt started Yosemite National Park in America, long before Kaiser Wilhelm II established a Tosha Game Reserve in Southwest Africa, what became Namibia, we had the Sabi Reserve in the Transvaal. So Paul Kruger was a trendsetter. He was the world leader in conservation. Before any other head of state saw the need for nature reserves, he saw the need. And right at first, they banned any hunting. No hunting in this area. This is to be kept as natural as possible. And that became such a heritage, one of the greatest heritages in the world. I'd say Kruger National Park is one of the favorite places in the world for me to visit. Well, Paul Kruger displayed tremendous wisdom and restraint in how he handled the treachery of some prominent mining families in the attempt to foment revolution. The failed Jameson raid, led by Cecil Rhodes's most trusted leader, Leander Starr Jameson, after whom Jameson Hall is named at the University of Cape Town. He was the first leader of Rhodesia, Leander Starr Jameson. Well, he did the dirty work for Cecil John Rhodes and the Anglo-American Company, and he tried to foment revolution on the Witwatersrand, and then he was coming in to help save these miners who were apparently being persecuted by the Boers. Well, instead of hanging the plotters, who were meant to be Transvaal citizens, or at least residents, and instead of imprisoning the invaders, which is what his people demanded, Paul Kruger handed Jameson and his team over to the British government to deal with. Now, he knew they probably wouldn't face justice. In fact, they were released very soon. But the fact is, it was diplomatically wise, because if he had either hung them or had them shot or imprisoned them, it could have led to a war back in 1895. And he knew he didn't have the ammunition, he didn't have the weapons. His people were not prepared for war with Britain in 1895. Now, there's a lot of amusing stories of Oom Paul on state visits overseas. On one occasion, he walked into a French banquet hall in Paris, only to immediately turn around and walk out declaring, "I'm sorry, I wasn't aware that you women weren't dressed yet." And this was a protest against the immoral fashions prevalent in Paris, and they had to put on something more modest before he came back in. When President Paul Kruger announced that any church in Pretoria could receive an acre of land free to build the house of worship on, he had the Jewish rabbi approach him requesting his acre, which seems a bit of a cheek. So Oom Paul thought for a moment, then he responded, "You can have half an acre. Jews only believe half the Bible." When the rabbi invited the president to dedicate the synagogue, Oom Paul solemnly removed his big black hat and declared, "In the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, I dedicate this synagogue to the glory of God." So it might be the only synagogue dedicated to the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. But good for Oom Paul. When the radical economic, political challenges that followed the discovery of gold on the Witwatersrand, President Kruger was concerned the miners could soon outvote the farmers. One of his stories was, if I'm traveling in my Osava down the road and I see you and your family walking, and I offer you a ride in my Osava, you have no right to say, "Well, we outnumber you, this Osava is now ours." He said, "I'm giving you a ride, doesn't mean you have the right to my property." Well, that's logic. But he had common sense, which isn't very common anymore. So to counter the possibility of the Uitlanders outnumbering the burghers, he made the conditions of naturalization more demanding. In some cases requiring 5 and then 10 years living in the country before he could become a citizen, which doesn't seem that extreme to us, but the British acted like this was such a threat to freedom and democracy. And so in 1890, the government restricted the Uitlander franchise for presidential and Volksraad elections to only naturalized citizens who'd been in the country for at least 14 years. And a second Volksraad was created to represent the Uitlander interests. And that could be elected by naturalized citizens of at least 2 years. And so you can see the British had a concern. So Alfred Milner, you will notice he came down Milner Road to get here. That's named after this lowlife. This British High Commissioner was an ardent imperialist committed to agitating Uitlander dissent, creating opposition to Kruger's government in the Transvaal. His goal was to absorb the Transvaal and the Orange Free State into a British South Africa. You can see the map. The British controlled not just the Cape Colony and Natal, and at that stage even Basutoland and the Transkei, but even Bechuanaland, what today is Botswana, and Southern Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia, which of course today is Zambia and Zimbabwe, Malawi, going all the way up towards Tanzania. So the British had a lot of territory already, but they coveted the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, not just for the railway line, but because it had all these gold deposits as well. So as the British invaded the Transvaal in May 1899, President Kruger was sent overseas against his protestations. He wanted to stay and fight, but he is now pretty old and he had his fighting days. They said, you can serve us better as our ambassador and representative in Europe. So he had to raise support for the Boer cause, and he fled through Portuguese East Africa, what today is Mozambique, to Lorenzo Marques, what today is Maputo, where the Dutch warship the Gelderland was sent specifically by Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands to bring him through the British blockade. And so, defying the British naval blockade, this brave queen, she was only 18 at the time, and she was defying her grandmother, Queen Victoria, in doing this. She transported, and of course the British could have sunk this vessel. This was a bold dare. To bring President Kruger to Europe, and he was well received first in France, I think landing in Marseille, and well received throughout the whole of Europe as an honored leader. And here's a model of the Gelderland in Kruger House in Pretoria, and a modest warship, no match for the Royal Navy, but nevertheless a brave move. In Europe, Paul Kruger was greatly honored as the principled leader of a courageous people who had been most unjustly invaded and abused by the British Empire. It's interesting, when you go to the Kruger House in Church Street, you can see many of the trophies and awards granted by the Tsar of Russia, the Emperor of Austria, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, from the Dutch, the French, the Italians, the Swiss. There's even exhibits of gifts and awards given by the American people. In 1900, the Boers were the most honored, respected people in the world, the most admired people in the world. The British were the most despised people on the planet in 1900. Interesting how the media can change things, that by 1960, we were the most hated and despised people in the world, and the British were lifted up as heroes, but that's not the way people saw it in 1900. And you can see this if you just go to Kruger House in Pretoria. Oom Paul died in exile in Clarence in Switzerland, 14 July 1904. 14th of July is Bastille Day, remembering the French Revolution. Interesting connection of dates. On the 16th of December, Day of the Covenant, 1904, his remains were reburied in Heroes Acre in Church Street Cemetery in Pretoria. And you can see it was a big event. People poured out from all over to honor this great principled leader, who the British had prevented from returning to South Africa when they took over the Transvaal, but they couldn't stop his remains being reburied there. And what I've given you on Paul Kruger is a chapter in our book, Sketches from South African History, which is also available in Afrikaans. A statue of Paul Kruger in his characteristic formal dress stands now in the centre of Church Square in Pretoria, in front of the old Volksraad. And unfortunately, this magnificent monument is now behind wire and bars because of its being vandalized. Many of these beautiful plaques have been ripped up. The rifles have been sawn off and stolen from the guard of honor of the burghers around the base of the monument. Some feet of these burghers have been sawn off as well. So there's been a lot of vandalism over the years, and that's why they've made a replica of this monument and moved it to Oranje where it'll be safe. These plaques around show elements in the life of Paul Kruger, such as on Commando and campaigning, negotiating, such as at the Sand River Convention, representing the concerns of the burghers and his different activities. And this is the magnificent old Volksraad in Pretoria, and the old High Court of the Transvaal. The Kruger gold coin is named in honor of Paul Kruger and features his face on the one side and a springbok on the other. And interestingly, to give you an idea, there was a time when a South African rand was equal to an ounce of gold. The South African rand was once the most powerful currency in the world. And an illustration for myself, recently my daughter got married, and I was in a real quandary. How was I able to afford my daughter's wedding? I mean, weddings are expensive these days. My daughter wanted a wine farm outdoor wedding. I mean, that sort of complicates your life, you would think. And then I remembered, I think I've got a gold coin left. I've got a Kruger rand. Back in 1988, when I was out shopping with my wife to get her a decent engagement wedding ring, it was not the engagement ring, that had been given by my mother, but to get a wedding ring, we on impulse bought a Kruger rand. And I can see the price. The Kruger rand was bought now back in 1988 for 600 rand. 600 rand bought me a Kruger rand in 1980. Can anyone guess what a Kruger rand costs today? Yes.
50,000 rand.
Out of date, 60,000 rand. So what I put 600 rand into in 1988 had increased to 60,000 rand, which paid for my daughter's wedding. So finding that one Kruger rand tucked away in my safe years later, answered the prayer and covered catering and everything else that I need for my daughter's wedding. So that just shows gold is a good investment. It's a great investment. But remember, that's what the South African rand used to be worth. At one time, when I was born, a Kruger rand would have been equal to 1 rand. So it just shows you how much our money has been debased. By the way, we used to have a regular guest speaker here, Dr. Stephen Mitford Goodson. He is an economist who was once director of the South African Reserve Bank. He said to us that prices don't increase. Money gets debased. So he said 1/10 of an ounce of gold back in the time of Christ would buy you a Roman toga, leather sandals, leather belt. And he says today, 1/10 of an ounce of gold will buy you a suit, tie, leather shoes. So he said the price has not changed. It's the money that's been debased. Now, I remember getting 50 cents pocket money when I was 12 years old, and that was a lot of money. 50 cents. I mean, at that stage, a cinema ticket was 20 cents on a Saturday matinee. Packet of chips was 4 cents. Packet of popcorn at cinema was 5 cents. Cup of Coke at cinema was 5 cents. And I could buy an Airfix model aircraft like a Spitfire or Messerschmitt or a Tiger tank for 45 cents. So 50 cents was a good amount of money back then. I mean, today people think 50 rand's not even that much. So you can see it's money that's been debased. It's not that prices have gone up. Well, a street in St. Gallen in Switzerland is called Krugerstrasse, obviously named after him. And his greatest monument is the Kruger National Park, which, by the way, I saw in the news today, the EFF, which stands for Everything for Free Party, the EFF is campaigning to change the name of the Kruger National Park. Now, in marketing, brand name is everything. Kruger National Park is a known, respected entity in tourism worldwide. And they want to change the Kruger National Park probably to something unpronounceable. that nobody can spell either. And that I trust will fail. Well, especially as the head of the EFF is guilty of a whole lot of crimes and he should be going to prison soon. But anyway, if you go to Pretoria, you can see Kruger House. Now, Kruger House was the president's mansion back in 1899. And these lion statues at the entrance were actually donated by Bonnie and Bartow, one of the diamond magnates from Kimberley. You can see the Transvaal Republic's emblem. Notice it's got the anchor of the Cape, it's got the Conservationist and the lion as some of their symbols. Eindracht Mark. In unity is strength. A pretty humble but well-decorated lounge and dining room. I don't think he could fit all his grandchildren. I don't think he could fit even his children around his dining room table, but nevertheless, Paul's desk. This is where the president stayed. And he was always accessible. He had one of the first telephones in Pretoria, and he was always accessible to his burgers. The people could come and speak to the president on his stoep and get cooksisters, rusks, and coffee and chat. And you can see a very humble dwelling, but tastefully looked after, and a well worth visiting museum. Just to see what the kitchens were stocked with, and of course there would have been a lot of hospitality there, to see how it was before our modern conveniences, lots of hard work, and the mothers at that time had a lot to do. They had to make their own soap, they made their own candles. Most of the food was actually prepared by the mother. You can't imagine how much of our time has been saved by modern conveniences. For example, even today, do you know, most girls in most of the world today spend most of their day collecting water, fetching water, carrying it, and chopping wood and making fires. So just electricity and plumbing has made our lives immeasurably easier. But even today, most girls spend most of the day collecting water and chopping wood. And I know that because when I work in places like Sudan or the Congo, Nigeria, this is what we see. So this would have been what a kitchen at that time would have looked like. Notice even the broom, pretty basic. You'd really get a sore back leaning over, not having the long brooms we've got. And you can imagine making cheese. I think that's for chopping biltong probably. Mm-hmm. And you can get a bit of a snapshot into what life was like just 100 years ago. And they've got memorials all over Kruger House, including an Orsavar that he would have traveled on at one stage. This was your main transport for many years. And then they've got not Air Force One, but they've got Railway One. This is what the president's railway carriage looked like. And every room seems to have an open Bible. Beautiful old illustrated Dutch Bibles. And his cabinet room, Oom Paul's personal kitchen, and all of the equipment they would have had. Now we're back to the house. But you can see the president's chair prepared, and these are some of the woodworks that were donated to him. When he's on the Gelderland ship, the sailors made a footstool to help him get into bed because he was getting a bit arthritic and having trouble getting into these high beds that they had on the battleship. There's all kinds of busts and artwork that have been made of Oom Paul, and you get something of the determination of this strong man. I remember seeing these stamps. Can you imagine there was a time when 3 pence would pay for an envelope? But our first mailing from our mission back in 1984, it was 4 cents a stamp for a letter within the country. And I could send a 5-kilogram box of books overseas to Britain or America for under R5. And it arrived. That's back when we actually had a post office that worked. Another thing we've been liberated from. Well, I've done articles on Paul Kruger, which were published in Yoke Tijdschrift. And if you're interested, we've got a whole lot of great history books, some on the table here, lots in the bookshop below. History is so important. We're going to have the author of Bulala here later on today, just before lunch, to give another presentation on Paul Kruger, different person's perspective. But my main contribution to South African history is the Sketches from South African History book. When we were homeschooling our 4 children, I did the history and geography, and my oldest daughter didn't mind the fact that I sometimes would pull out my red pen and cross out things and write in better dates and details, because my oldest daughter just trusts her dad. My second daughter, Daniela, was more critical. How can a textbook be wrong? Daniela, you've got to meet some of the people who write these textbooks. You'd understand, many of them are just government employees. And then she said, well, how do you know you're right? Which is a good question. Well, Daniela, I met P.W. Botha. We're good friends with P.W. Botha's daughter, Razan. I know Ian Smith. He's a friend. We had him here regularly in this mission house even, as a guest. I've interviewed him on radio. I was brought up in Rhodesia. I've been to the Congo. I know what happened in Nigeria. And how do you know about this, that, and the other in Europe? Well, I was on Bible smuggling operations with my father-in-law, after whom this hall is named, the Bathman Memorial Hall. Bill Bathman worked 67 years as a missionary, and he was friends with Richard Vormbrandt, Brother Andrew. My wife grew up with people like Brother Andrew and George Verver. Around the dining room table, Sabrina Vormbrandt knew these people. So there's things I know for sure that I know is wrong in the textbooks. And I've got very dissatisfied with a lot of the history books. A lot of the history books that we have in our schools are actually worthless. Sorry, but I mean, it's shocking. Many of the Christian history books are not much better. Sometimes the Christian history books are the same as the secular history books, the same selection of characters, events, and subjects. They just add a Bible verse to it. Well, that's not good enough, because I don't think the French Revolution was a good thing, and I don't think that people like Nelson Mandela are heroes we should be lifting up, and I don't think Martin Luther King Jr. is a worthy person to keep quoting like he's the Bible or something like that. So I decided we needed Christian history books, written from a totally Christian perspective. And the greatest century of missions, the greatest century of Reformation, victorious Christians who changed the world, and Sketches from South African History are some of my contributions to Christian history aimed at home educators, because I think we can do better than just copying the secular textbooks and adding a scripture verse at the end of it. So that's one of our views about homeschooling, but we've got a whole lot of history books available. And Stephen Mitford Goodson wrote some of these books, like on Jan Smuts and on Hendrik de Wit. He was the man who was once director of the South African Reserve Bank. So we know some of the great authors who can help us get the other side of the story. Now, Stephen Mitford Goodson wrote on Smuts because Smuts was the one who started state capture in South Africa. He opened the South African Reserve Bank, which, as Stephen Goodson said, the South African Reserve Bank is not South African. It has no reserves. It's not a bank, which is a good summary. And he explained economics in a way that we could understand. And he was interested in Hendrik de Wit because Hendrik de Wit was assassinated when he had expressed that he was going to abolish the South African Reserve Bank. And next thing you know, he got assassinated, just like John F. Kennedy in America got assassinated as he was about to abolish the Federal Reserve Bank in America. Which, again, as Stephen Goodson says, all wars in the 20th century are bankers' wars.
Yes.
And that's a really interesting thing to discover. You know, by sheer coincidence, the enemies that have been destroyed by the Allies in the 20th century are countries that had national banks, not Rothschild usury banks, which run on huge amounts of, well, what do we call it? Usury, just extortion. So we've got to know our history and we can be prepared for a better future.
May I ask, how was the Second World War being caused by banks and money?
Well, because Germany and Italy and Japan got rid of Rothschild banks. They wouldn't take usury banks controlled by the Rothschild family. They had their own money and currency. They issued their currency without paying interest to a so-called Federal Reserve Bank. So, for example, Stephen Goodson explained it just like this, and he's written the book, A History of Central Banking and the Enslavement of Mankind. Same thing with Russia. The Bolshevik Revolution happened in a country that didn't have a Rothschild bank. And there was real vindictiveness against the Russian royal family because they'd refused Rothschild-type bank back in 1815 after the Treaty of Vienna ended the big French Revolutionary Wars with Napoleon. So he explained it like this. The government wants to borrow R1 billion. No problem. That's what the Reserve Banks exist for. So they go to the Southern Reserve Bank, we want R1 billion, please. No problem. They sort of pull out a checkbook, figuratively speaking. Here's R1 billion. Now that R1 billion did not exist. It's now just a blip on the computer screen. They created that R1 billion out of nothing. There's no gold, platinum, silver, anything to back it. It's just a number that they've given. But while the money is fake, the interest that the Reserve Bank charges to the government, or should we say to the taxpayer, is real. So the people have to work long and hard to pay for their money that they've just borrowed. I mean, do you know that the British only recently finished paying for the First World War? I think they're still paying for the Second World War. Now, okay, first of all, the Bank of England, okay? Now, the Bank of England...
So you're talking about the government of England now owing the Bank of England?
That's correct. Now, the Bank of England's controlled by the Rothschilds. So, for example, Lord Nathan Rothschild was a member of the British War Cabinet, and he was head of the Bank of England, and he owned a lot of the companies that produced the shells, the artillery, the weapons, the ammunition, most of which were in Coventry, interestingly enough. You know, you've heard of the bombing of Coventry. What many people miss the fact that Coventry was one of the biggest arms manufacturing towns in Britain. And so here's Rothschild, he declares war. And then he agrees to borrow money from himself, I mean, as part of the cabinet. And then he charges interest to the taxpayer for the money that he has loaned them. So imagine how much money you save when you just print the money you need for your people. You don't take a loan from a foreign bank, a foreign-owned bank, which is called the South African Reserve Bank or whatever they want to call it. And it's a scam. It's such a scam that Henry Ford once said, if the people of America understood how the banking system worked, there would be a revolution in the morning. So to give you an example, there was a time in history when usury was banned. In fact, that was done by King Richard. He banned all usury, evicted all the bankers who would use usury. Usury is condemned in the Bible about 60 different passages. And not only that, but Magna Carta, the first charter of government, which limits the restriction of government, is mostly focused on banning usury. Which is...
Usually in Afrikaans?
Tertia, do you know what the name is for usury in Afrikaans?
Is it wanneer je geld leen en moet rente betaal?
I think it's the charging of interest on money loans. So usury, where you charge interest on bank loans and so on, it's a total scam because there might be a service charge, but for example, a percentage charge is ridiculous. So, you know, say you want to post a letter which has a check in it to America, and the letter is going to cost you a R1 stamp, say. And yes, but if your check that you're going to send there is going to be for, say, 10,000 Rand, you've got to pay a 1,000 Rand stamp, you know, things like this. Why should the service charge be more than what it costs the bank to deal with? Taking a percentage is an absolute ripoff. And so they are impoverishing people. When they banned all usury in Europe and they kicked out the people doing the usury, that's when they built the cathedrals. They had all this extra time. The people in Europe, and this again taken from A History of Central Banking and Enslavement of Mankind book, when usury was banned in Europe, people had 240 holidays a year. People worked something like 140 days of the year, and the rest was holidays. And that's when they built the cathedrals, because they had all this excess of time, money, and energy, because they weren't being ripped off by the banks. And so usury is one of the biggest tools of the anti-Christian element to cripple us, waste our time. Today, I think We are working for the government from January through May. Because the first 5 months of the year, you're just working for the government, you're paying taxes. I mean, even right now, the amount of tax you pay, do you know when you go to petrol stations, you're paying more money to the government than...
Then you get money you pay for petrol.
The government gets more out of every purchase of petrol than the oil company, the oil producing country, or the petrol station. More. It's bizarre. So there's a lot of ways in which they rip us off and steal from us. And that's what causes wars. So countries like Syria didn't have a Rothschild usury bank. Libya didn't have a Rothschild usury bank. I mean, what a coincidence that the countries that didn't have that kind of bank were targeted. And that you could also say for the Transvaal under Paul Kruger too. They did not tolerate usury either. So our banking system is corrupt as anything. I used to think people who robbed banks were bad. Now I think the ones running the banks are the worst criminals.